Hey, stop scrolling for a second. What you're about to hear happened in a mansion in Charleston, South Carolina, in front of 40 wedding guests, a $5,000 dress, and one maid who had nothing left to lose. A woman laughed and said the words no one could take back. She thought it was a joke. She thought the maid would just stand there and cry like she always did. She was wrong. What happened in the next 10 minutes changed 4 lives forever, and by the end of the story, you won't be able to look away. Stay with me. This gets unbelievable. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from, and which country do you belong to? Drop it in the comments, I read every single one. Today's story is about pride, humiliation, and the kind of quiet strength that doesn't announce itself until the exact right moment. It's about a woman named Naomi Carter, a wedding dress worth more than her yearly salary, and a dare that was never supposed to be answered. This one has a twist you will not see coming. Watch until the end. It's worth it. It started like every other day at the Whitmore estate. Naomi Carter had worked as a live-in housekeeper for the Whitmore family for almost 3 years. She was 26, quiet, careful with her words, and precise with her hands, the kind of precise that came from a childhood where nothing was ever handed to you twice. She folded linens the way her grandmother taught her in Georgia, corners crisp, edges matching. She dusted the crown molding in the East Wing without ever being asked twice. She knew which floorboard in the hallway creaked and always stepped around it so she wouldn't wake the family before 6 in the morning. The Whitmores lived in a colonial-style mansion just outside Charleston, the kind of house with a circular driveway and a fountain that ran even in winter. Richard Whitmore had made his fortune in commercial real estate. His daughter, Vanessa, was 29, blonde, and engaged to a man named Ethan Cole, a rising architect from Boston who had designed 2 buildings downtown before he turned 30. Vanessa was getting married in 6 weeks. Naomi had heard about the wedding from the moment she started work that January. She'd heard about the venue, a private vineyard 40 minutes outside the city. She'd heard about the 300 guests, the imported orchids, the string quartet flown in from New York. But mostly, she'd heard about the dress. The dress had arrived on a Tuesday morning in a garment bag, so long it had to be carried in by 2 people. It was a custom Vera Wang, deep red, one shoulder draped in hand-sewn crystal beadwork, a slit that ran from ankle to hip. Vanessa had chosen red instead of white for the reception gown, a bold, unforgettable statement piece she planned to change into after the ceremony. $5,200. Naomi knew the number because she was the one who'd signed for the delivery. She hung it in the guest room closet exactly as instructed, smoothing the fabric with 2 fingers before she closed the door, careful not to leave a single fingerprint on the silk. She never imagined she'd be standing in front of that dress in 6 weeks, in front of 40 people, being dared to put it on. Naomi's own life outside the Whitmore estate was small and steady. She rented a 1-bedroom apartment above a laundromat with her 8-year-old daughter, Mia. Mia's father had left 2 years earlier, and Naomi had rebuilt her life one shift at a time, cleaning, cooking, sometimes driving for a rideshare app on weekends when the bills stacked higher than usual. She never complained about the work. She was grateful for it. The Whitmores paid on time. The room they gave her in the staff quarters was warm, and Richard Whitmore, in his gruff way, had never once been unkind to her. Vanessa was a different story. From the first week, Vanessa treated Naomi the way some people treat furniture, present, useful, and beneath notice. She left towels on the bathroom floor and never said thank you when they reappeared folded. She called Naomi the help in front of guests, even when Naomi was standing 3 feet away. Once, when Naomi accidentally chipped a china plate while unloading the dishwasher, Vanessa docked $20 from her pay without discussing it, simply leaving a note on the kitchen counter. Naomi never argued. She had learned a long time ago that arguing with people like Vanessa cost more than it was worth. She had Mia to think about. She had rent due on the 1st. She had a mother back in Savannah who depended on the money Naomi sent every month for her insulin. So she swallowed the comments, folded the towels, and kept her head down. But there was one thing Vanessa didn't know about Naomi Carter. Before her daughter was born, before the divorce, Before the string of jobs that led her to the Whitmore estate, Naomi had spent 4 years in fashion school in New York. She had a scholarship. She had talent, real talent, the kind her professors used to pull aside and tell her not to waste. She had once been offered an internship with a boutique design house on 7th Avenue. She had turned it down to move home, and care for her mother after a stroke left her unable to work. She had packed away her sketchbooks, sold her sewing machine to cover a hospital bill, and never told anyone at the Whitmore house about the life she used to imagine for herself. To Vanessa, Naomi was simply the maid. A woman who dusted shelves and pressed linens and existed somewhere just outside the edges of a normal conversation. Vanessa had no idea that the woman folding her wedding napkins had once designed a gown that walked a runway in Manhattan. She had no idea that Naomi's hands, the same hands that scrubbed her bathroom floors, had once been trained to cut silk to the 1/8 of an inch. She had no idea, because she had never once asked. 6 weeks before the wedding, the final dress fitting was scheduled at the estate instead of the boutique, as a favor to the designer's assistant, who was flying in from New York for the day. Vanessa insisted the whole household be present for what she called the reveal. Her parents, her bridesmaids, even Ethan, who had been banned from seeing the ceremony gown but was allowed, this once, to see the red reception dress, since it wasn't considered bad luck. Naomi was asked to help set up the room. Chairs were arranged in a semicircle around the antique full-length mirror in the west parlor. Champagne was poured. The garment bag was unzipped with theatrical slowness by Vanessa's mother, and the dress was hung on a mannequin form so everyone could see it before Vanessa put it on. The room fell into hushed appreciation. Guests murmured about the beadwork. Ethan, standing near the doorway in a cream linen suit, smiled the quiet, proud smile of a man who couldn't wait to see his bride wear it. And that was the moment Vanessa, riding a high of attention and champagne, turned toward Naomi, who was quietly refilling glasses near the back of the room, and said the words that would change everything. "You know," Vanessa said, loud enough for the whole room to hear, a smirk pulling at the corner of her mouth, "if you could actually fit into this dress, Naomi, I'd hand you Ethan myself." The room went silent. Somebody laughed nervously. Somebody else didn't. Naomi froze, the champagne bottle still in her hand, feeling every eye in the room turn toward her at once. She had no idea that the dare Vanessa had just thrown out as a joke, a cruel, careless, thoughtless joke, was about to unravel everything Vanessa thought she knew about the woman who cleaned her house. For a moment, nobody moved. Naomi stood near the back wall with a champagne bottle still tilted slightly in her hand, watching a thin gold thread of liquid drip onto the tray she was holding. Her ears were ringing. She could feel her pulse in her throat. Vanessa's mother let out an awkward laugh and reached for her daughter's arm. "Vanessa, honey." "What?" "I'm serious." Vanessa turned fully toward Naomi now, arms crossed, chin lifted, enjoying the sudden spotlight the way she enjoyed most spotlights, completely. "I mean it. Look at her." She gestured, almost affectionately, the way someone gestures at a stray dog they find amusing rather than threatening. "If Naomi can zip herself into this dress, I will personally hand Ethan over."
"Wedding chanchalet."
"She can have him." A ripple of nervous laughter moved through the bridesmaids. One of them, a woman named Britt with a glass of champagne already halfway to her lips, snorted. "Vanessa, stop, that's not funny." "I'm not being mean," Vanessa said, in the tone of someone who was, in fact, being extremely mean. "It's a compliment. I'm complimenting the dress. It's a size 2. It's basically a joke, Mom, relax." Ethan, standing by the doorway, shifted uncomfortably. He glanced toward Naomi for half a second, an apologetic, almost sympathetic glance, before looking back at his fiancée. "Vanessa, come on." "What?" "She works here. She's not going to be offended. Right, Naomi?" Every head in the room turned toward her. Naomi set the champagne bottle down on the sideboard with careful, deliberate hands. Her mind was doing something strange in that moment, not spinning with anger, not scrambling for an excuse, but going very, very still. She thought of Mia at home with the neighbor, doing her spelling homework at the kitchen table. She thought of the $20 docked from her last paycheck without a word of explanation. She thought of 3 years of towels picked up off bathroom floors, 3 years of the help, 3 years of swallowing her voice to keep a roof over her daughter's head. And she thought, unexpectedly, of a sketchbook buried in a box in her mother's attic in Savannah, pages and pages of gowns she had designed at 22 years old, gowns she had once believed she would build a career on. "Sure," Naomi said quietly. "I'll try it on." The room went dead silent again, but this time for a different reason. Vanessa blinked, clearly not expecting an actual answer. What? You said if I fit into the dress, you'd give me Ethan." Naomi's voice was calm, almost gentle, but there was something underneath it now, something the room could feel even if they couldn't name it. "I'm not asking for your fiancé, Vanessa. I don't want him, but I'd like to try on the dress. If that's all right." A slow, delighted grin spread across Vanessa's face, the grin of a cat that believed the mouse had just wandered directly into its paws. "Oh, this is going to be good," she said, clapping her hands once. "Everyone stay seated. This is happening." Vanessa's mother tried, weakly, to intervene. "Vanessa, this is a $5,000 custom gown. We can't just—" "It's fine, Mom. She's not going to hurt it. She's going to zip it 2 inches, and then we're all going to have a good laugh and move on with the fitting." Vanessa turned to Naomi, eyebrows raised, triumphant. "Go ahead. The guest room's right through there. Take your time." Naomi picked up the dress from the mannequin with 2 careful hands, the same way she had hung it 3 weeks earlier, and walked toward the guest room without another word. Behind her, she could hear Vanessa already narrating the moment to her bridesmaids in a stage whisper. "This is honestly kind of iconic. I should be filming this." Britt, the bridesmaid with the champagne, didn't laugh this time. She was watching Naomi's back as she disappeared down the hallway, and something about the housekeeper's posture, steady, unbothered, almost calm, made her uneasy in a way she couldn't quite explain. Ethan didn't laugh either. He stood near the doorway with his hands in his pockets, jaw tight, wondering, not for the first time in the last 6 weeks, exactly who he was about to marry. Inside the guest room, Naomi closed the door behind her and stood alone with the dress for a moment, running her fingers over the crystal beadwork at the shoulder. Her professional eye, the one she hadn't used in years, immediately noticed things the average person never would: the hand-finished seams, the boning structure at the waist, the fact that the beadwork pattern was slightly asymmetrical in a way that was clearly intentional, a signature detail. It was, she had to admit, a beautiful piece of work. She unzipped it slowly, and that was when she noticed something that made her breath catch. Sewn into the inside lining, small and easy to miss unless you knew exactly where designers hid such things, was a tiny embroidered label. Not the Vera Wang tag everyone assumed was the only one. A second, smaller tag, hand-stitched. Naomi stared at it for a long moment, her heart suddenly pounding for a completely different reason than the humiliation waiting for her on the other side of that door. She knew that stitch pattern. She knew that exact combination of thread color and needle spacing because 8 years ago, she had been taught to sew it herself by the very hands that had put it there. The name stitched into the lining was small, barely half an inch of pale gold thread against ivory silk, but Naomi would have recognized it anywhere.
R. Delacroix.
Renata Delacroix. For a moment, Naomi forgot where she was. She forgot about Vanessa waiting on the other side of the door with her bridesmaids and her champagne and her cruel little dare. She forgot about the 40 guests, the $5,000, the humiliation she had just calmly volunteered to walk into. She stood in the guest room of the Whitmore estate holding a stranger's wedding dress, staring at a signature that had once meant everything to her. Renata Delacroix had been Naomi's mentor in design school. A retired couture seamstress who had spent 30 years working for major fashion houses in Paris and New York before taking on a handful of promising students in her final years of teaching. Renata had seen something in 19-year-old Naomi that most people never bothered to look for: patience, precision, an instinct for structure that couldn't be taught, only recognized. She had personally recommended Naomi for the 7th Avenue internship Naomi eventually turned down to go home and care for her mother. Naomi hadn't spoken to Renata in almost 6 years. The last time they'd talked, Naomi had called to explain voice breaking, why she couldn't take the internship. Renata had gone quiet on the phone for a long moment and then said something Naomi never forgot. Talent doesn't expire, Naomi. It waits. Don't let anyone convince you it's gone just because you put it down for a while. And now, impossibly, here was Renata's signature, hand-stitched into the lining of the dress that had just been used to humiliate her. Naomi's hands were shaking slightly as she turned the dress over, examining the construction with new eyes. This wasn't simply a factory-produced Vera Wang gown. This was a piece Renata herself had personally reworked, likely as a private consulting job for the design house, the kind of high-level, quiet freelance work legendary retired seamstresses sometimes did for a select handful of clients willing to pay extraordinarily well for a master's hand on a single garment. Which meant this dress had passed through hands that had once, briefly, shaped Naomi's entire future. Out in the parlor, Vanessa's voice carried faintly through the door, already impatient. Naomi? We don't have all day, sweetie. Naomi looked at herself in the guest room mirror, tired eyes, hair pulled back in the same low bun she wore every day for work, hands that had spent the morning scrubbing a bathtub before pressing linens before pouring champagne for people who barely saw her as a person. And for the first time in a very long time, she let herself remember who she used to be before all of that. She stepped into the dress. It did not fit. Not entirely. It had been tailored precisely to Vanessa's measurements, and Naomi's frame was different, fuller through the hips, an inch taller. The zipper caught 2/3 of the way up her back, exactly as Vanessa had gleefully predicted it would. But something else happened in that moment that Vanessa had not predicted at all. Naomi looked at herself in the mirror, the crystal beadwork catching the afternoon light through the window, the deep red fabric draping the way only master-tailored silk drapes, the slit falling perfectly along her leg despite the dress being built for someone else's body, and for one suspended, silent moment, she didn't see a housekeeper standing in a dress that didn't fit her. She saw the designer she used to be. She reached back, gently working the zipper down to release the tension on the seams before it could tear, and that was when she noticed something else, something practical, something only a trained eye would catch. The boning at the waist was crooked. Not broken, not visible to a casual glance, but structurally compromised, likely from an improper fitting adjustment made after Renata's original work, probably rushed by a junior seamstress at the boutique trying to save time before the final delivery deadline. If Vanessa wore this dress as it currently was, dancing, moving, embracing guests for 6 or 7 hours at her own wedding reception, the seam would very likely give out at the worst possible moment, probably somewhere around the 3rd or 4th hour, right as the champagne started flowing and the dance floor filled, and every phone in the room was recording. Naomi stood there for a long moment, dress half-zipped, staring at the flawed seam, and felt something complicated rise in her chest. She could say nothing. She could let Vanessa walk out of that guest room in 6 weeks in a dress that would humiliate her in front of 300 people, a small, quiet, delicious kind of justice for every towel left on the floor, every $20 docked without explanation. Or she could do the one thing her 3 years at the Whitmore estate had trained her never to do. She could speak up. Naomi closed her eyes for a moment, thinking of Renata's voice on the phone 6 years ago. Talent doesn't expire. It waits. She opened the guest room door and stepped out, not in the dress. She had changed back into her uniform, the gown draped carefully back over her arm, and walked toward the parlor where Vanessa and her bridesmaids and her fiancé and her parents were waiting, expecting to laugh at her. What she said next was not what any of them expected. It doesn't fit, Naomi said simply, stepping back into the parlor, the dress draped with careful precision over both arms exactly as it had been when she carried it out. Vanessa let out a short, triumphant laugh and clapped her hands together once. Well, obviously. I mean, no offense, but there's something else you should know, Naomi continued, her voice calm, even, carrying a quiet authority the room had never heard from her before. The boning at the waist seam is compromised. Whoever did the final fitting adjustment rushed the stitching. If you wear this for more than a few hours dancing, sitting, moving around a reception, that seam is going to fail. Probably right at the point of most tension, which on a dress like this is usually center back, right where everyone will be looking when you turn around for photos. The room went quiet in a completely different way than it had 10 minutes earlier. Vanessa's smile faltered. I'm sorry, what? I know because I trained in garment construction, Naomi said. For years, fashion school in New York. I recognized the work almost immediately when I put it on, the beadwork pattern, the boning structure. Somebody did meticulous, expert-level restoration on this dress. And then somebody else, in a hurry, undid part of it without realizing what they were compromising. Vanessa's mother leaned forward, frowning. Naomi, is this a joke? No, ma'am. Ethan had stepped further into the room now, his earlier discomfort replaced by something sharper. Genuine attention. Can you show us? Naomi laid the dress carefully over the back of a chair and turned the waist seam outward, pointing to a section along the interior lining where the stitching pattern shifted, subtly but unmistakably, from tight, uniform hand-stitching to looser, slightly uneven machine work.
Here.
See how the tension changes? This section was clearly done by someone different and in a hurry. It's not obvious from the outside, but it's structurally weaker. On a static mannequin, in a boutique fitting room, you'd never notice. On a moving body, for 6 hours, dancing, it's a real risk. Britt, the bridesmaid, leaned in to look, genuinely startled. Oh my God, she's right, look at that. Vanessa snatched the dress off the chair, turning it over herself, squinting at the seam like she expected to see nothing at all, and then went very still. How? She said slowly. Do you know this? You're a housekeeper. There was no cruelty left in her voice this time. Just genuine, baffled confusion. Naomi hesitated for only a moment before answering. I went to fashion school. Parsons in New York. Full scholarship. I studied under Renata Delacroix for 2 years before I graduated. The name landed in the room like a dropped glass. Vanessa's mother's hand actually flew to her mouth. Renata Delacroix reworked this dress. The boutique told us it was a private consultation. They wouldn't even tell us who did it. They said the name was confidential per her contract. It's stitched into the lining, Naomi said quietly. Small, gold thread, inside the left seam. I recognized her signature the moment I saw it. She was my mentor. Vanessa flipped the dress inside out with shaking hands, searching, and found it. The tiny embroidered R. Delacroix Naomi had described. For a long, stretched-out moment, nobody in the room said anything at all. I was offered an internship on 7th Avenue after graduation, Naomi continued, her voice steady, not bitter, simply stating facts that had waited a very long time to be said out loud. I turned it down to move home and take care of my mother after her stroke. I sold my sewing machine to help pay a hospital bill. I've been doing housework for 3 years to support my daughter and send money home for my mother's insulin. That's not a story I tell people because it's not really anyone's business, and because most people who look at me in this uniform have already decided who I am before I open my mouth. She looked directly at Vanessa now, and there was no anger in her expression, which somehow made it land harder than anger would have. You asked if I could fit into your dress, and joked you'd hand me your fiancé if I could. I don't want your fiancé, Vanessa. I never did, but I do know construction. And I'm telling you, as someone who spent 4 years learning exactly this, if you wear this dress as it currently is, it is going to fail in front of 300 people on the most photographed day of your life. Vanessa stood frozen, dress clutched against her chest, staring at the woman she had spent 3 years calling the help, without ever once asking her name meant anything more than a line on a payroll sheet. Why, Vanessa finally said, voice smaller than anyone had ever heard it, didn't you ever tell us any of this? Naomi's answer was quiet, and it was the line that would end up changing the entire dynamic of that household for the rest of the story. Because nobody ever asked. The silence that followed lasted almost 30 full seconds, an eternity in a room full of people who were used to filling every quiet moment with conversation, laughter, the clink of champagne glasses. It was Richard Whitmore, Vanessa's father, who finally broke it. He had been standing near the fireplace for most of the fitting, mostly silent, the way he usually was during his daughter's more dramatic moments. Now he stepped forward, studying Naomi with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not the polite, distracted courtesy he usually offered her, but genuine, focused attention. "You said Parsons," he said. "Full scholarship?" "Yes, sir." "And Renata Delacroix personally mentored you?"
For 2 years, yes.
"She recommended me for the internship I turned down." Richard exchanged a glance with his wife, who was still holding the dress, running her thumb almost reverently over the small gold thread signature stitched into the lining. "Do you have any idea," Richard said slowly, "what it costs to get Renata Delacroix to personally consult on anything anymore? She stopped taking private clients almost 4 years ago. The boutique wouldn't even confirm to us who did the restoration work. We paid an absurd premium, and they told us it was, quote, a legacy consultation, non-disclosed. We assumed it was some anonymous senior tailor on staff." "She doesn't take students anymore either," Naomi said quietly. "Not since her health started declining a few years back. I'm honestly surprised she's still doing any private work at all." Vanessa, still holding the dress against her chest, looked between her parents and Naomi with an expression caught somewhere between shame and disbelief. The bravado that had filled the room 15 minutes earlier had drained out of her completely, replaced by something rawer and far less comfortable, the sudden, dizzying realization that she had spent 3 years underestimating a person entirely and had just humiliated herself trying to humiliate someone else. "I need to sit down," Vanessa said, and did, sinking into the nearest armchair, the dress pooling in red silk waves across her lap. Ethan crossed the room and crouched beside Naomi's chair, not Vanessa's, which several people in the room noted, though no one said anything yet. "Can it be fixed?" he asked. "The seam, I mean, before the wedding." "Probably," Naomi said. "It's not catastrophic damage, it's a rushed repair. If someone with the right skill reinforces the boning channel and restitches that section properly, it should hold. But it needs to be done by someone who actually understands the original construction, not just patched again by whoever the boutique sends out this time." "Could you do it?" Ethan asked. The question hung in the air. Naomi hesitated. It was one thing to point out a flaw. It was another thing entirely to offer to fix, with her own 2 hands, the dress belonging to the woman who had just publicly mocked her in front of 40 people, the same dress that had been the centerpiece of her humiliation 20 minutes earlier. "I haven't done couture-level work in 6 years," Naomi said honestly. "My hands remember the technique. I'm not sure my confidence does." "I'll pay you," Vanessa blurted out suddenly, sitting forward in the armchair, and then immediately winced at how transactional it sounded even to her own ears. She tried again, softer this time. "I mean, I'd be grateful. Genuinely. Whatever the boutique would charge or more. She stopped, swallowed, and for the first time in the entire scene, looked directly at Naomi with something that resembled actual humility. "I was awful to you just now. And apparently I've been awful to you for a long time and didn't even notice, because I never bothered to notice anything about you at all."
I'm sorry.
"I mean that. Truly." Naomi studied her for a long moment. She thought about the $20 docked without a word, the towels on the floor, 3 years of the help. She thought about how easy it would have been, 20 minutes ago, to simply say nothing about the seam and let this woman's wedding day collapse in front of 300 witnesses as a kind of silent revenge she'd never have to answer for. But that had never really been who Naomi was, even when it might have been justified. "I'll look at it properly," Naomi finally said. "No promises yet on whether I can fix it myself, but I'll look, and if I can't, I know exactly who to call." Renata still keeps in touch with a few of her former students. Between us, we can find someone qualified. Vanessa's mother, still holding the dress, looked at her daughter and then back at Naomi with something like wonder. 3 years, she said quietly. 3 years in this house, and none of us ever knew any of this about you. You never asked, Naomi said again, simply, without bitterness. Just truth, laid out plainly for anyone in the room willing to actually hear it. It was Britt, the bridesmaid, standing near the window with her champagne long forgotten in her hand, who finally said what everyone else in the room was beginning to feel. "I think," Britt said slowly, We all just learned something today that has absolutely nothing to do with a dress. Nobody argued with her. And in the quiet that followed, something in the room had shifted permanently, though none of them yet understood just how far that shift was about to go over the following 6 weeks, or what Naomi Carter was about to discover about her own future in the process. The days that followed the fitting were unlike anything Naomi had experienced in 3 years at the Whitmore estate. Vanessa's mother, whose name was Diane, appeared in the staff quarters 2 mornings later carrying a cup of coffee. Not a request, not an instruction, just coffee, offered the way you'd offer it to a guest. "I thought," Diane said, a little awkwardly, standing in the doorway of a room she had walked past 100 times without ever really looking into, "you might want this before your shift." It was such a small gesture. But Naomi found herself blinking back unexpected emotion as she accepted the cup, because in 3 years, no one in that house had ever once brought her anything. Naomi spent her evenings that week, after Mia was asleep and her regular duties were finished, in the small sewing corner she'd quietly set up in the staff quarters using a borrowed machine from a neighbor and a repair kit Diane had insisted on buying her, proper interfacing, silk thread in 3 shades of red, a set of fine needles that cost more than Naomi's entire weekly grocery budget. Her hands were slow at first, rusty, hesitant in a way that embarrassed her a little. 6 years was a long time to leave a skill folded away in a box. But muscle memory has a way of returning, thread by thread. On the 4th night, she called Renata Delacroix. She hadn't spoken to her in 6 years, and her hands shook slightly dialing the number she still had memorized. When Renata picked up, her voice older now, a little rougher, but unmistakably hers, Naomi almost couldn't get the words out. "Naomi Carter," Renata said slowly, once Naomi identified herself, and there was real warmth in it, real surprise. "I wondered what happened to you. You disappeared." "I had to go home," Naomi said. "My mother." "I remember," Renata said gently. "You called and told me. I hoped you'd come back to it eventually. Talent doesn't expire, remember? It waits." Naomi explained the dress, the seam, the Whitmore wedding. Renata listened without interrupting, and when Naomi finished, there was a pause on the line. "I did that restoration," Renata confirmed. "Private client, non-disclosed, exactly as you'd expect. I did the boning and the beadwork myself. I was recovering from a minor surgery at the time and had my assistant finish the waist seam under my direction because I couldn't sit at the machine long enough. She's talented, but she was rushing. I remember telling her to slow down on that exact section, and clearly she didn't listen closely enough." Renata sighed. "I'm not surprised it's compromised. I should have checked it myself before it shipped." "Can I fix it?" Naomi asked. "I don't want to make it worse." "Send me photos," Renata said. "Every angle, close up. I'll walk you through it stitch by stitch if I have to. You have better hands than you remember, Naomi. You always did." Over the following 2 weeks, Naomi rebuilt the compromised seam under Renata's long-distance guidance. Video calls at 11 at night after Mia was asleep. Photos texted back and forth. Careful stitch-by-stitch instruction from a woman who had once believed in her more than she'd believed in herself. It was slow, painstaking work. But something happened to Naomi during those 2 weeks that surprised her more than anything Vanessa had said in that parlor. She remembered how much she loved this. Not the housework she did every day to keep her daughter fed. She took no less pride in that and never would. But this specific work, the precision of it, the quiet meditative focus of turning flat fabric into something that could make a person feel beautiful and strong at the same time. She had genuinely forgotten how alive it made her feel, sitting at that little borrowed machine at midnight, fixing a stranger's wedding dress with the same care she once poured into her own designs. Meanwhile, something else was shifting quietly in the Whitmore household. Vanessa began, hesitantly at first, actually talking to Naomi. Not instructions barked over her shoulder. Real conversation. She asked about Mia. She asked, one afternoon in the kitchen, what Naomi's designs from school had looked like, and when Naomi hesitantly pulled up a few photos on her phone, old runway shots from a student showcase 8 years earlier, gowns Naomi had built from nothing but sketches and stubbornness, Vanessa went quiet for a long moment, scrolling through them. "These are beautiful," Vanessa said finally, sounding almost embarrassed by how much she meant it. Naomi, these are genuinely beautiful. Why aren't you doing this? Naomi didn't have a clean answer for that.
Rent.
Insulin. A daughter who needed stability more than her mother needed a dream that had already cost her once. Life happened, was all she said. But Vanessa, for the first time in 3 years, actually looked like she was listening, really listening, to a woman she had walked past 1,000 times without seeing. None of them yet knew that the repaired dress, and the friendship quietly rebuilding itself in its wake, was about to lead to something none of them could have predicted 6 weeks earlier, in a parlor full of champagne and cruelty and one dare that was never supposed to be taken seriously. 3 weeks before the wedding, Ethan Cole asked Naomi a question that changed the direction of the entire story. He found her in the small sewing corner one evening, the door propped open, soft lamplight spilling into the hallway as she carefully worked a row of crystal beads back into place along the dress's shoulder seam, a section that had loosened slightly during Naomi's earlier repair and needed reinforcement. Ethan knocked lightly on the doorframe, and Naomi looked up, startled to see him there. In 3 years, he had barely spoken more than a few polite words to her in passing. "Sorry to bother you," he said. "I just wanted to say what you did. Speaking up in that fitting. It couldn't have been easy." "It wasn't," Naomi admitted. "I almost didn't. I'm glad you did." He hesitated, then stepped further into the doorway, hands in his pockets, the same posture he'd had that day in the parlor. "Can I ask you something? And you can absolutely tell me it's none of my business." Naomi set down her needle. "Okay. Why did you really turn down that internship? Vanessa told me about it, the 7th Avenue thing. She said you gave it up for your mother, but I guess I'm asking, do you regret it?" 6 years later, looking back. It was a question no one had ever asked her directly, and Naomi found herself answering more honestly than she expected to. "Every day," she said quietly. "Not the choice itself. I'd make it again in a heartbeat. My mother needed me, and there was no one else. But I regret that I let it become the end of the story instead of just a detour. I told myself for years that door was closed permanently. I stopped sketching. I sold my machine. I let myself believe that version of me just stopped existing." She looked down at the dress in her lap. "This is the first real design work I've done in 6 years. I forgot how much I missed it until I had no choice but to remember." Ethan nodded slowly, and then said something that caught Naomi completely off guard. "I design buildings for a living. Structures people live in, work in, get married in, like the vineyard we're using in a few weeks, actually, which my firm designed 2 years ago. There's an overlap between what you do and what I do that I don't think people always recognize. Precision, vision, making something functional feel beautiful." He paused. "My firm's client, the vineyard owner, she's opening a boutique event space next door this fall. High-end, invite-only bridal and formal wear. She's been struggling to find a designer in residence who actually understands couture construction, not just retail alterations. I could be wrong, but I think you'd be exactly what she's looking for." Naomi stared at him. "Ethan, I haven't worked in fashion in 6 years. I don't have a portfolio. I don't have. You have a Parsons degree, a mentor named Renata Delacroix who apparently still vouches for you enough to walk you through a couture repair over video call at midnight, and you just single-handedly saved my fiancé's wedding dress from falling apart in front of 300 people," Ethan said. "I think that's a stronger portfolio than most people walk in with." Naomi didn't answer right away. She thought about Mia, about rent, about the stability of a job she knew, even if it didn't pay much, even if it wasn't the life she'd once imagined for herself. Taking a risk on something uncertain, at 26, with a daughter depending on her, it felt reckless in a way that made her chest tighten. But underneath the fear was something else. Something that had been quietly waking up inside her for 3 weeks, stitch by careful stitch. "I'll think about it," she said finally. "That's all I'm asking," Ethan said and smiled, genuinely, warmly, the way you'd smile at someone you respected rather than someone you barely noticed. He turned to leave, then paused in the doorway. "For what it's worth, Vanessa's been different since that day in the parlor. Better, I think. I know it doesn't erase 3 years, and it's not really my place to ask you to forgive any of it. But I think you gave her something that day that had nothing to do with the dress. You gave her a reason to actually look at people instead of past them. That's rare. I don't think she'll forget it. Naomi thought about that long after he left, about how one dare, born from cruelty and thoughtless pride, had somehow cracked open a door none of them had known was sealed shut. She didn't yet know that in 2 weeks, at the wedding itself, that same door was about to swing wide open in front of every guest in the room. The morning of the wedding arrived warm and golden, sunlight spilling over the rows of grapevines at the Ashford Hill Vineyard 40 minutes outside Charleston. Naomi had been asked, genuinely asked this time, not instructed, to be present for the final dress preparations, not as staff, but as the person responsible for the repair that had held the gown together through 3 fittings and a dozen careful adjustments in the weeks since. Diane had insisted on it. Vanessa hadn't argued. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of white orchids and string quartet music, Vanessa walking down a grass aisle in a traditional gown, Ethan waiting at the end of it with the same steady, genuine warmth Naomi had come to recognize in him over the past 6 weeks. It was, by every account, a beautiful wedding. But it was the reception, 3 hours later, that everyone in that room would still be talking about years afterward. Vanessa emerged from the bridal suite in the red reception gown, Renata Delacroix's original vision, fully restored, the crystal beadwork catching the string lights strung across the vineyard's open-air pavilion, the seam Naomi had rebuilt stitch by stitch holding perfectly through hours of dancing, embracing, laughing, moving exactly the way Naomi had warned it might fail. It didn't fail. Not once. Sometime around 10 o'clock, as the band took a short break and guests mingled with champagne between courses, Vanessa unexpectedly took the microphone from the bandleader, something that had not been on the reception program. The room quieted, guests turning with mild curiosity, assuming a standard thank you toast to family and friends. What she gave instead was something no one, least of all Naomi, expected. "I want to tell you all a quick story," Vanessa said, her voice slightly unsteady, though whether from champagne or genuine emotion, no one could quite tell. 6 weeks ago, I stood in a room and made a joke at the expense of someone I had worked alongside for 3 years without ever really knowing her name meant anything more than a line on a payroll sheet. I dared her to try on this dress and told her cruelly that if it fit I'd hand her my fiancé. A ripple of uncomfortable, curious laughter moved through the crowd. It didn't fit. But in trying it on, she found something none of us knew was there, a structural flaw that, had it gone unnoticed, would have had this dress falling apart on this exact dance floor a few hours ago, in front of every single one of you. Vanessa's eyes found Naomi standing near the edge of the pavilion, half in shadow, clearly unprepared for what was happening. "That woman," Vanessa continued, "is Naomi Carter. She has a design degree from Parsons. She trained under Renata Delacroix, the same legendary seamstress who originally restored this dress. She gave up an internship on 7th Avenue 6 years ago to care for her sick mother, and she has spent the years since raising her daughter alone and working incredibly hard to give her the life she deserves, all while most of us in this house never bothered to ask her a single question about who she really was." The pavilion had gone completely silent now, every guest's attention fixed on the bride. She rebuilt this dress with her own hands over the past 6 weeks, guided by her old mentor over video calls at midnight, after a full day of work, because I asked her to, after I humiliated her in front of my own family. And she said yes anyway, because that's apparently just who she is. Vanessa's voice cracked slightly. "I don't think I deserve the grace she gave me that day. But I want everyone here to know her name, and to know what she did, because I spent 3 years failing to see her, and I don't ever want to make that mistake again, about her, or about anyone." She raised her glass, hand trembling slightly. "To Naomi, who gave me far more than a repaired dress." The applause that followed was not polite, obligatory wedding toast applause. It rose slowly, guest by guest, until the entire pavilion was on its feet, 300 people applauding a woman who, 6 weeks earlier, had been invisible to nearly every person in that room. Naomi stood frozen near the edge of the tent, tears she hadn't expected slipping down her face, as Ethan crossed the dance floor toward her, smiling, and gently steered her forward into the light. Not to be humiliated this time, but to be seen, fully and finally, for exactly who she was. What happened over the following weeks would go even further than any of them expected that night. 2 weeks after the wedding, Naomi received a phone call that she would later describe as the moment her old life and her new one finally, fully collided. It was Elena Marchetti, the owner of Ashford Hill's new boutique bridal atelier, the one Ethan had mentioned in passing that night in the sewing room. She had heard the story from Ethan, then confirmed it independently with Renata Delacroix herself, who, when reached, had apparently spent nearly 20 minutes on the phone enthusiastically vouching for a former student she clearly still believed in completely. "I'd like to meet with you," Elena said simply. "I'm not offering you a job over the phone based on a wedding reception speech, however moving it was. But I'd like to see your work. Bring whatever you have, sketches, photos, anything from school, anything since. Come in Thursday." Naomi almost didn't go. The old fear returned in full force in the days leading up to the meeting. The fear of reaching for something and having it slip away again, the way it had 6 years earlier. She sat on the floor of her apartment the night before with a dusty box of sketchbooks her mother had finally shipped her from Savannah, flipping through pages she hadn't looked at in years, half convinced the drawings would look amateurish now, a young woman's fantasy rather than real, viable work. They didn't look amateurish. If anything, looking at them now, with 6 years of hard-won life experience behind her, Naomi could see exactly how to improve half of them. She brought the sketchbooks, along with photos of the Whitmore repair, to the meeting Thursday morning. Elena Marchetti, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s with decades in the bridal industry, went through every page slowly, asking pointed technical questions Naomi hadn't been asked in 6 years, about draping technique, about her approach to structural boning, about how she'd handle a client with an unconventional body type needing a fully custom silhouette. Naomi answered every question. Some of them, she realized partway through, she answered better than she would have at 22, because now her answers were informed not just by training, but by a decade of real, hard-earned understanding of what it actually meant to build something durable enough to hold together under real pressure, real movement, real life. Elena closed the sketchbook and looked at her for a long moment. "I'm opening for private clients in the spring," she said. "I need someone who can do restoration work like what you did on that Whitmore dress, and someone who can eventually design original pieces once we build the client base. The pay to start won't match what a big New York house would offer, but it's stable, it's local, and there's real room to grow into something bigger. Renata Delacroix vouching for you personally is not something I take lightly, Ms. Carter. Very few people earn that." Naomi accepted the position 2 days later, after running the numbers with a calculator and her landlord's patience and a long, honest conversation with Mia about what it might mean for their life to change. New schedule, new possibilities, the same steady love underneath it all. She gave the Whitmores 2 weeks' notice, which Diane received with tears and a long, tight hug that surprised them both. Vanessa insisted on throwing her a small, genuine goodbye gathering in the kitchen, the same kitchen where, 7 weeks earlier, Naomi had quietly absorbed a note about $20 without a word of protest. "I know a goodbye party doesn't fix 3 years, Vanessa said, handing Naomi a small wrapped box that turned out to contain a beautiful set of professional sewing shears, engraved with her initials. "But I wanted you to know I see you now. All of you. And I'm grateful, more than I can really say, that you gave me the chance to." Naomi hugged her, genuinely, without reservation, the way you hug someone who has earned it rather than someone you're simply expected to forgive. 6 months later, Naomi Carter had her first client meeting as lead restoration designer at Ashford Hill Bridal Atelier, sitting across from a nervous young bride holding her late grandmother's wedding dress, asking hopefully if there was any way to save it for her own wedding day. Naomi looked at the fragile, decades-old lace, and smiled the way Renata Delacroix had once smiled at her, 22 years old and full of a future she couldn't yet see. "Yes," Naomi said. "I can absolutely save this. Let's get to work." A year after that fitting room dare that was never supposed to be taken seriously, Naomi Carter stood in her own small design studio, a converted room above the Ashford Hill atelier that Elena had given her once client demand made a dedicated workspace worth the investment, surrounded by half-finished gowns, spools of thread in every color, and a corkboard covered in sketches that were entirely, unmistakably her own. Mia, now 9, sat on a stool in the corner after school most afternoons, doing homework, occasionally handing her mother pins when asked, utterly unbothered by the transformation that had reshaped their entire life in 12 short months. To Mia, it had always simply been obvious that her mother was talented. It had taken the rest of the world a little longer to notice. Vanessa and Ethan visited occasionally, not as clients exactly, though Naomi had done the alterations on Vanessa's sister's dress the following spring, but as something that had genuinely, unexpectedly become friendship. Vanessa had changed in ways that went beyond that one wedding reception speech. She volunteered now, regularly, at a program that helped domestic workers access continuing education, something she'd started less than 2 months after her wedding, quietly, without publicity, because, as she told Naomi once, almost shyly, she didn't want credit for finally learning something she should have known all along. Renata Delacroix, in her final years before fully retiring, took on one more student before she was done teaching for good. She didn't have to think hard about who. Naomi thought often, in quiet moments at her sewing table late at night, about how close she had come to staying silent that day in the Whitmore parlor. It would have been so easy. Safer, even in the short term, no confrontation, no risk of losing a stable job over a moment of pride. She could have let Vanessa walk into her own wedding day wearing a dress that was structurally destined to fail, and called it justice, and no one would have blamed her. But the truth she carried with her now, the one she found herself repeating to every young apprentice who passed through the atelier doubting whether their own skills mattered, was simpler than justice and far more powerful. Speaking the truth, even when it costs you something in the moment, rarely closes doors. More often, if you're patient enough and honest enough to see it through, it opens ones you didn't even know were still there. The dress that was supposed to humiliate her had, in the end, become the very thing that gave her back her life. If this story moved you, even a little tonight, I want you to do something for me before you go. Hit that like button. It genuinely helps this story reach someone else who might need to hear it today. Subscribe to the channel if you're new here, because we tell true, heart-touching stories just like this one every single week. And if you know someone who's ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or invisible in a room full of people who should have known better, send them this video. You never know whose door it might quietly help open. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. I'll see you in the next story.